just spent a few minutes talking about addiction because it's so misunderstood in this culture. It's basically seen as either a choice that somebody makes. So then you have somebody well-meaning but terminally naive, like Nancy Reagan, who puts up signs on the highway saying, "Just say no." And they tell kids in the high school, "Just say no, to drugs." Well, how successful those programs have been is indicated by the fact that last year in the U.S., there were over 100,000 overdose deaths. More, as I said, either this morning to this group or to Jeff before this conversation, that's more people, double the number of people dying in 1 year of overdoses than the number of Americans who died in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, and Iraq put together. That's how successful the Just Say No and the legal prohibitions have been. The other, so I won't spend any time on that nonsensical choice hypotheses. I've never known anybody who ever woke up one morning and said, "Hey, I'm going to be an addict." It's not how it works. The second belief about addiction is that it's an inherited disease of the brain. So they say it's about 40 to 70% genetic. No, it isn't. Nobody has ever found a single gene for addiction. Or when they think they had, 2 years later they had to retract it. The problem is the finding of it is front page news, the retraction is back page news. So people believe in this genetic determination. Nobody's ever found a group of genes that if you have them, you'll be addicted for sure. Nobody's ever found a group of genes that if you don't have them, you won't be addicted. What they have found is there a large group of genes that the more of them you have, the more likely you may be to have psychosis or addiction or ADHD or depression, almost any other mental health conditions. But what is not being transmitted is these conditions, because if the conditions were transmitted, then everybody would have, the genes would have the disease. And nobody without the genes would have the disease either. That's just not the case. There's something being transmitted, and I'll tell you about that in a moment. But there's this belief that addiction is this inherited brain disease. And it's got some features of a disease, it relapses, it remits, it damages organs and so on. You can treat it with medications in some cases, but that doesn't make it a disease. So let me give you a definition of addiction that some of you would have heard before, but listen to it with an eye to yourself personally. So I define addiction as a very complex process of mind and body, which manifests in behaviors where a person suffers negative consequences as a result of and doesn't give up despite the negative consequences. But pleasure, craving, and relief in the short term, harm in the long term, difficulty giving it up or refusal to give it up. Those are the traits of addiction. Now, if you're observant, you'll have noticed that I said nothing about drugs. Of course, it includes drugs. Also can include caffeine and nicotine, alcohol, obviously. It could also be sex, or gambling, or shopping, or internet, or pornography, or eating, or self-harm, self-cutting, or extreme sports. Anything that you crave for pleasure and relief, but which harms you or creates harm, and you don't give up, that's an addiction. Okay, anything. So with that definition in mind, I'll just ask you, if you recognize that ever in your life you've had an addictive pattern to anything, just please raise your hand, okay? And as always, virtually everybody, I don't see anybody without raised hands. I'm gonna ask you now, some of you, just to shout out, put your hand up and I'll point to you, and then when I do, I'm not gonna ask you what you're addicted to or when or how long. I mean, nobody's gonna ask you that here. But what did it give you that you wanted? What did you like about it, okay? Any volunteers? Yes?
Relief from loneliness.
Relief from loneliness, okay, thank you. Somebody else, yeah.
Escape from confusion and black hole.
So escape from emotional distress? Okay, thank you. Yes? Okay, escape, okay. Three people have used the word escape now. Who needs to escape? Somebody in pain, somebody in prison, somebody who's constricted. Okay. Pleasure, you said. Anybody else?
Feeling that I mattered.
That you mattered. Okay. So that's enough now. So that pleasure, escape from emotional pain, distress, loneliness, a feeling that you matter. Are these good things or bad things? They're wonderful things. In other words, the addiction wasn't any kind of a disease. It was your attempt to solve the problem of loneliness, the problem of emotional pain and distress, the problem of lack of pleasure. So rather than being the primary problem, addiction becomes a secondary problem, but a temporary solution, which then creates many more problems. So as the teacher Eckhart Tolle says, addictions begin in pain and end in pain. But they're not diseases. And the question then becomes, and somebody have heard me say this before, my mantra under addiction is not why the addiction, but why the pain that people are trying to escape. And if you want to understand why the pain, you've got to look at their lives, not their genes. I'll come back to genes in a minute. But their lives, what happened in their lives? In other words, what am I talking about? Trauma. Addiction is the quintessential trauma response. And I don't care what the addiction is to. Relationships, sex, gambling, pornography, shopping, eating, drugs, alcohol, nicotine, caffeine, internet, I don't care. It's always a trauma response, an attempt to soothe the impact of trauma. In other words, it's another adaptation. Now, when it comes to genetics, there is something genetic going on here. It's very important to recognize it. But it's not these conditions. What's being passed on in these genes is sensitivity. People have different degrees of sensitivity. The same thing can happen to two people who will have much more impact on a more sensitive individual. That's not their fault, that's just their nature. Largely, that's how they're born. So that the analogy I often give is if you tap yourself on the shoulder, no pain whatsoever, you got clothing here, you got skin there, no pain. But if you imagine that your shoulder was bare and there was a burn close on your skin so that the top layers of the skin were sloughed off and your nerve endings were close to the surface, we call that being thin-skinned, actually. And you touch yourself with the same force, now you're going to have severe pain. So the external force doesn't have to be any greater, but the pain that you experience could be immensely greater depending on how sensitive you are. And it's these sensitive people, by the way, who become artists and intuitives and actors and comedians. Because it's that sensitivity that allows them to be that creative. They just take in so much more of the environment. And if you had a bit of talent or a lot of talent, you got a Robin Williams or a Gilda Radner or any number of highly sensitive, highly talented individuals who fell victim to disease that came out of the original trauma. Both Robin Williams and Gilda Radner, you know how they became comedians? They wanted to be close to their mothers. And Robin Williams talked about her, this weird desire to be close to your mother by making a joke. Nothing weird about it. Nothing is more natural than a child wanting to be close to the mother. The tragedy is that he had to crack jokes in order to elicit her smiles. I'm not blaming the mother. She had her own history, probably. Or not probably, definitely. But what's being transmitted is this incredible sensitivity. And then what happens from there depends on how the environment acts on that sensitivity. So that you can have the same genes in a nurturing environment and you just become a happy, joyful, creative person. But in a tougher environment, you suffer more pain. And the more pain you suffer, the more adaptations you have to take on. And those adaptations will show up in a form of illness. So, what I'm saying here is that, no, then I could go into the neurobiology of addiction. You know, it's a biological thing. Well, sure, it's a biological thing. Everything is a biological thing. It goes without saying, we're biological creatures. So if you look at, say, like why people use heroin, you just have to look at why does the body even respond to heroin? It's because we have receptors where the heroin molecule can bind or the fentanyl molecule can bind. Why do we have receptors for these opiates? Because we have our own internal opiates. And why do we have our own internal opiates? Because they have three important functions without which life is impossible. One of them is pain relief. So we have our own internal opiates, it's called endorphins, for pain relief. They also make possible pleasure and reward and joy, elation. So when people go bungee jumping, the higher their level of endorphins, the greater their elation. Now just say no to pain relief. And just say no to joy and elation. Okay? And those aren't even the most important functions. The most important function is they make possible this little thing we call love, which is the attachment relationship between parent and infant. And so if you take infant mice and you knock out their endorphin receptors so they can't have endorphin activity up here, they will not cry for their mothers on separation. Now, what would that mean in the wild? It would mean their death. That's how important the opiates are. Now, when you have a child who experiences trauma, some kind of emotional deprivation, and that affects the development of the brain circuits of endorphins, then they do heroin. You know what they feel? Two people told me. One is a sex trade worker who was 27, and I said, what does the heroin do for you? And she said, the first time I did heroin, it felt like a warm, soft hug. Then there's this guy in detox that I looked after once, and I've talked about him before. He's this big, burly, muscled, tattooed, barrel-chested, shaven-headed, earringed, beautiful specimen of a man, a heroin addict. And I asked him, well, what does it do for you? And she said, Doc, I don't know how to tell you this, but it's kind of like when you're sick and you're 3 years old and you're shivering with a fever and your mother puts you on her lap and warms you in a warm blanket and gives you warm chicken soup. That's what the heroin feels like. The heroin addict is just looking for love. That's all it is. Just say no to love, okay? So, again, it's an adaptation. I could say much more about addiction, but I won't. Let me just sum it up here then. That authenticity attachment dynamic, when it veers towards the inauthenticity as it has to in many childhoods, will then force us to adapt behaviors that, as in the case of our guest, lead to illness. It also means that when people get to learn about that and relate it differently to themselves, that can make a huge impact on their physical health conditions. I'm not promising that we found a cure to everything. I'm saying in a significant number of cases, it makes a huge difference. And then furthermore, the mental health conditions that people are diagnosed with as these genetically determined biological diseases of the brain also begin as adaptations. Which if we learn about, then we can actually become active agents in our own healing, whether from physical or mental illness. But there's always meaning in it. So in the book, we give the example of the comedian Daryl Hammond, who was a Saturday Night Live mainstay for many years. And Daryl had an episode in college where he saw people talking, but the words weren't coming out of their mouths at the same rate somehow. He was psychically in severe distress. So he was given medications and given X number of diagnoses over a period of something like 20 or 30 years. He went through, let's say 20 years, he went through something like 30 psychiatrists, had multiple psychiatric diagnoses, multiple medications, until one psychiatrist finally said to him, I don't want to call what you have a disease. You've been hurt in life. And Daryl had been severely abused in childhood. And nobody had asked him that. Nobody, if you can believe that, over decades had asked him that. Despite all the evidence linking childhood trauma and mental health conditions. In fact, there's a British psychologist, Richard Bentall, a member of the British Academy, who said that the evidence linking childhood adversity to mental health problems is as strong as the evidence linking smoking and lung cancer. And despite that evidence, again, it's largely ignored in medical practice. And Daryl said that in this story, I'm the only one without power. The healing comes in taking the power back, in taking back the agency.